I'll have to admit that this is a little bit difficult for me as a Baptist to do a video on the Methodists and praising them. But this is a denomination I'm a little more familiar with compared to others. I have quite a few friends that are Methodists. So I decided to do my project here on the history of the Methodists, especially in relationship to the United States. So the Methodist movement has its origins in the ministry of John Wesley. Now, John Wesley was born in the early 18th century to Samuel and Susanna Wesley. Samuel Wesley was a parish priest in the Anglican Church. And while growing up, John Wesley had barely escaped a fire in the parish house. And Susanna Wesley, John's mother, remarked that John was the brand that God had plucked out of the fire. And this sort of uh, miraculous deliverance from the fire left a lasting impression on John Wesley, who believed that God had called him to the ministry and to call him to do great things. So Wesley attended Oxford University, and from there became ordained as a minister in the Anglican Church. However, he had always felt that there was something lacking in him, that he had yet to achieve any true level of spirituality. So he had crossed the Atlantic Ocean once a new opportunity arose. The new colony of Georgia needed Anglican priests in the beginning of that new venture. So he answered the call, thinking that he was going to be able to not only preach to the white colonists, but also preach to the natives. In fact, he would later remark, I went over to save the Indians, but I wondered who would save me. So after a perilous journey across the Atlantic, he came to the colonies in about 1737, 36, 37, and he had for lack of a better word, a very rough time, especially with one particular woman that he was very much in love with, Sophie Hopke. But apparently that relationship did not work out. He refused her communion one Sunday morning, and as a result, he was about to be prosecuted for his actions. And so, in order to escape justice, he had to sneak on board a ship under cover of darkness to leave the colony. So he returns home to England. He is very discouraged, and he feels like his ministry has been a failure. So one day he's walking the streets of London, and he sees this Moravian congregation that's on Aldersgate Street. And he goes into the meeting, and he listens to them read a sermon written by Martin Luther on the necessity of justification by faith. And he says that at that moment, while he was hearing the sermon, he says that his heart was strangely warmed. And in later years, he would say that this was the moment that he had truly experienced a conversion, a second birth, and that he had met Jesus at this point in his life. So the uniqueness of John Wesley's ministry was that he would minister to people that the Anglican Church really had no time for. So he would go to those that were in poorer towns. He would go into the slums, and he notably went to the miners in Wales, where it said that the only time that those Welshmen had ever cried, and that the dirt from their soot-covered faces was ever clean, was from the tears that they had shed listening to Wesley's sermons. So, from this new movement that Wesley had formed, emphasized the necessity of a personal conversion and holiness. And this idea of holiness in terms of a life should reflect your inward change that Christ has manifested itself in you. And so, from these ministers that would become involved, both ordained and lay leaders within the Methodist Church, began to spread this message far and abroad, not just in England, but also in the New World. There were people such as George Whitefield, who was a bit more of a Calvinist than Wesley, being an Arminian, but others such as Asbury and Thomas Coke, those who worked closely with Wesley, came over to the New World and began ministries of what were called circuit riders. So back then in the backwoods of North America, you didn't have church, or sorry, there was a lack of ministers, and churches often had one pastor one pastor was shared among several churches, in the circuit. And so throughout the year, the pastor would make the circuit to visit those various churches, which he would minister to at least once a month, maybe even once every 2 months, depending on how wide a circuit was. And so it was through this that the Methodists were able to get a foothold in North America at the same time that the Baptists and Presbyterians. And while the other denominations were doing some things that were very similar to this, the Methodists were the ones that were known for pioneering and really perfecting this technique of circuit riders which became almost synonymous with the Methodist movement. Now, during the 1840s and 50s, the issue of slavery had split many evangelical denominations, including the Methodists, along regional lines. And so the Methodist Church split. Those that had supported slavery, of course, were in the South. Those that opposed slavery were in the North. But after the war, they did manage to come together, as well as the Presbyterians. The Baptists were very notable in that they did not come together following the war compared to the other evangelical denominations. The Methodists would continue in various forms all the way up into the 1960s, which they merged with the United Brethren Church. The United Brethren were a church that had a very similar theology to the Methodists, but were separated by ethnicity. They tended to be more German in their ethnic makeup. And so when the Methodists united with the United Brethren, that's what formed what we call today the United Methodist Church. The name is not a reference to the North and South split coming together, but the unification of two essentially similar churches that were no longer divided by those that spoke English and those that were from a German background. So the Methodists actually had a significant impact on American evangelical Christianity in some ways that are so prevalent that we really don't think about them today. So probably their greatest contribution to American evangelical Christianity was the proliferation of hymns. Charles Wesley, John Wesley's brother, had written quite a few hymns that we all still sing today, but also Fanny Crosby and Ira Sankey in the 19th century wrote quite a few hymns, which are still favorites across denominational lines even to this day. Methodists had also been significant in their outreach when it comes to issues of evangelism and theology. Of course, Charles Finney, the prominent evangelical revivalist minister, that spoke to many Americans up in the Northeast. But you also had Dwight L. Moody. Now, Moody himself sort of founded a separate movement outside the Methodists, but Moody was very much influenced by the holiness movement and by Wesleyan theology. And then, of course, for many people who have read the great E.M. Bounds, who talked extensively on slavery, he himself, it's not slavery, prayer, and someone who in the Civil War had been a chaplain and which had shaped many of his beliefs concerning the power of prayer. A few other things we really don't think about as being Methodist contributions are popcorn and grape juice. Now, Orville Redenbacher, you probably have had some of his popcorn. He was a Methodist and very active within the Methodist Church. But when it comes to grape juice, there's an interesting story behind that. Baptists, we typically do not drink fermented wine. But it's not a Baptist invention, interestingly enough, but it is a Methodist invention. So the Methodists were initially very strong on teetotalism and abstinence from alcohol. One day, a man by the name of Thomas Bramwell Welch, who had come over to the United States from England, he had participated in a Methodist service, and to his horror, they were using fermented wine in communion. And so he decided that he was going to fix that, so he developed what he called Welch's unfermented wine, or as we know as it is today, Welch's grape juice. And so if you're part of a denomination that typically advocates for abstinence from alcohol, you have a Methodist to thank for your use of grape juice in the elements. And finally, Methodists had always had a certain social reform aspect to them. Wesley was pushing boundaries himself as he reached out to people that the Anglican Church had long neglected. And so that same kind of social activism and reaching out to the poor, reaching out to disparate groups, was pioneered by the Methodists as well, and something that was very important to them. So, for example, Methodists were involved in the Civil Rights Movement. Methodists, especially in the North, were also against slavery early in the 1860s. And in fairly recent years, Methodists, at least not all, but a considerable number of Methodists, were involved in the gay rights movement and their support of that. Today, the United Methodist Church, which is the largest Methodist denomination in the United States, is on the verge of a split between those that tend to be much more conservative and those that are a bit more liberal. We don't know if it's going to go 2 ways or 3 ways, or how things will shape up within the next couple of months or years. But we'll have to see which direction the Methodists will go. But regardless, of all the denominations in the early evangelical movements in the United States, from whether the Presbyterians and the Baptists, one cannot diminish the great impact that Methodists had on American evangelical culture and American society in general.